Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Byler, and we're continuing the series on pieces of content and people that changed my mind on Genesis. We are here again with another video from Tim Mackie, and this one's a Q&A from a sermon he did at, New Hope Church, and this is after the sermon. They had like a Sunday school session, and Tim answered questions that people had about Genesis and about the sermon. I'm not going to do a review of the sermon at this point. If you guys would like for me to do a review reaction of the sermon, let me know. I will link it below in the comments, so if you're curious, you're able to go and listen to that. But we're going to start here with the Q&A because the Q&A is the piece of content I ran into. I remember listening to it upstairs in my room back when I still lived with my folks, and there were things that he said during this talk that really caught my attention, that really got me thinking. Similar to his the first piece of content that I reacted to, the first thing he had said that really blew my mind. So before we get to this piece of content, let me go ahead and remind us what Tim said during the Q&A about the making of the Bible.
I trust that fundamentally it's just what we believe by trust.
Like Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
Tower of Babel, flood, call to Abraham. Where did he learn those stories that he wrote those down?
Yeah. So the question is, if Moses is the first named writer in the Bible, he's certainly not the first character in the storyline. Baruchs, Western Christians living in the 21st century, but it is for all of God's people to read the Bible and put it on her wall. So it forces you to become an intelligent reader of this literature that, if it's your conviction, speaks the divine word to you. And you may not feel like you're a scholar or whatever, and that's fine. You don't have to be. But if you want to know Jesus through these texts going into the promised land, many. And it's destructive, and that it's a dead end. It's a manual about the timeline and physical processes by which the physical universe came into existence. I think the man helping anybody is us, in my humble opinion. Destructive, many. And it's destructive, and it's an absolute betrayal of the teachings of Jesus, in my humble opinion.
Okay, I found it. So let's take a look at this real quick. This is what Tim said in the first video I reacted to regarding the nature of the story and the first bit of Genesis. Why did that happen there? Still figuring all this out. Okay. Here we go.
Another example that's a little more hot topic, but I think I have a deep conviction that it's a dead end and it's not helping anybody, is treating the Bible as if it's a manual about the timeline and physical processes by which the physical universe came into existence.
Timeline, physical processes. This is exactly what John Lennox said in the last video I talked about, where he said, let us not confuse the timing of creation with the happening of creation, or with the reality of creation.
I think the author of Genesis 1 through 3 in particular had just totally different purposes for what he's doing on those pages of the Bible, and that we're hurting our Christian witness by making those chapters refer to what we think are the physical processes by which the physical universe came into existence, and I just made a bunch of you angry.
Yeah. We're hurting our witness. Right, because as John Lennox was talking about, we make central something that's not central, right? Those who agree on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ can differ on their interpretations of Genesis, But when you make those necessary, as my friend was doing during the conversation we were having with our friend who was not a believer, if you make those claims about the nature of the nature that is being talked about in the beginning of Genesis, you're doing some people a disservice and you're hurting the witness. And the reason I pointed this out last time, and I'll say this explicitly, I said this in a conversation privately with a friend, the reason I'm pointing this out and being hard on those who are part of that 7-day creationist, more fundamentalist bent is because I see them doing this way more than I see those, say like myself, who are taking a literary or symbolic interpretation to those first chapters in Genesis, at least. I see people like us not making this problem central to salvation or central to bringing somebody into the fold, let's say, or counting them as a believer, whereas those who take a stricter view, a more literal view on Genesis, again, like my friend was doing, because it's so central to what they think of as true or real, will insist on this interpretation of Genesis as being primary, as being something that is to be proselytized about. So, and as I said last time, I'm not trying to proselytize with these videos. These videos are very much not for non-Christians. Again, I'm happy if you're here. I'm curious what you have to say, but this video is not for you, because this video is about an issue that, in all reality, is very secondary to what I would care about you thinking about the Bible. So, but that's what Tim said. It is a disservice when we think of them as talking about the literal physical creations, and we make them about the time in which that occurred. So that was in the first video. So we already know that Tim was on this literary interpretive train. I mean, that's his whole thing, even in this talk about the making of the Bible. It's literary connections and the way that that comes about through artistry, as authors write, as scribes pen, as people compile together the books in the Bible. That's why he calls it the making of the Bible, not the writing of the Bible. And so, to this Q&A at Hope Church, let us see what Tim has to say about the book of Genesis.
Well, glad you came back. Tim graciously agreed to kind of let the morning spill over into this Q&A session. So this is our chance to pick his brain. We'll probably try and keep this to, 20, 30 minutes max, just because Tim's probably got rumblies in his tummy and he's been working all morning, so we'll get him some lunch sooner rather than later. We'll try not to cut it short if there's good questions that are still being asked. I would like to start us off with this question that someone submitted during the first service. I actually love this question. Did God create dinosaurs? If so, why is it not mentioned in the Bible?
Great question.
It's a good question, right?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, it's one of those questions that what it generates is about 4 questions ahead of it that you need to really think about to come at that one.
Right.
I think I have an answer for that.
So let's let Tim answer first. And then you can share
well,
yourself.
it's one of these things where, so these creatures existed on our planet that are an extinct reptilian species that are gigantic, right?
Yeah.
So they don't exist now. And they seem to have existed a really, really, really long time ago. So, in one sense, it's not at all weird that they're not mentioned in the Bible, the same way that the word earth doesn't mean globe because of modern abilities to take pictures of the earth as a sphere. It's the same basic idea. It's that God chose to work by his Spirit through an ancient Hebrew author to paint a picture of the world and make claims about those questions. Who are we? Where are we? And to describe it in a way that communicated in their understanding of the world, the ancient Israelites' understanding of the world. And that didn't include the world as a sphere, and it didn't,
Right.
it didn't have any awareness of dinosaurs. So it's more like what purpose would it even serve for dinosaurs to be mentioned in the Bible? Because it would be introducing something that doesn't even exist in the biblical author's understanding of the world. But I know that some people think...
Okay, so here we hit on something that's important, that is central to Tim's taking of the book of Genesis, is the intended audience and those who wrote it were ancient Israelites. So God is going to use, back to our discussions on this podcast that we've had regarding, what was the phrase? Divine accommodation, about the fact that God is accommodating to a certain culture, a certain people, a certain time, that to write to them to have them write, to have them tell about the origins of the earth as they can understand would mean certain limitations. One of those limitations being that it's not going to involve everything that we would want it to involve, say dinosaurs, because dinosaurs were way before them and they didn't even know what they were. So why would they talk about it? Yeah. That's the basic idea that Tim's getting at here. I feel like I have to do it. A beginning is the time for taking the most delicate care that the balances are correct. This every sister of the Bene Gesserit knows. To begin your study of the life of Muad'Dib, then, take care that you first place him in his time, born in the 57th year of the Parash Emperor Shaddam IV, and take the most special care that you locate Muad'Dib in his place, the planet Arrakis. Do not be deceived by the fact that he was born on Caladan and lived his first 15 years there. Arrakis, the planet known as Dune, is forever his place. First place him in his time. We're going to understand, and this will come out in some more things that we talk about later. We're going to understand Genesis. We need to understand that people who have certain scientific bents or understandings, as Peterson talked about, right? Scientists and scientism hasn't been around for more than maybe 1,000 years. So it's very hard to posit that those who are writing the accounts of creation were doing it in any way that was the way that a scientist would now write about a lab experiment. Placement is time, and its place, ancient Israel, to the Hebrew people, the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What concerns do they have about telling of the earth, about telling of the first man and the first woman? So Tim's directing us towards this view, towards this concern to have for who wrote it, what's its time, what's its place, who's it for, why would they mention or not mention certain things. Let's continue.
The Bible came into existence through a process like that. The prophet was kind of just this passive person, or maybe under like a trance or something, and writing what they don't understand. The problem with that is the actual descriptions in the Bible of how the books of the Bible were written. There's quite a few, and they describe people in full control of their faculties. There are like prophets who have visions that blow their mind, like Ezekiel, and he sees all that stuff, and Isaiah. But those aren't the writing of the Bible. Those are prophets having visions. And then at some point, once he cleaned his clothes, I presume he peed his pants when he saw God, right? And once he got a different tunic on, that he then sat down and processed it, read his Bible, prayed a whole bunch, and then wrote Ezekiel chapter 1. So, on one sense, it's a boring answer to the question. So the other question that it raises then is, so God chose to work through human authors and their conception, say, of the structure of the world, and to speak his word, right, to people. What that then means is that there's all kinds of things that simply aren't going to be mentioned or taken into account. There are still things about our universe that we can now observe, like bones in the ground and stars that seem to be like millions and hundreds of millions of light years away and this kind of thing. And so what that caused us to do is to say, okay, I have a narrative in Genesis, and then...
I have a what? Have a what?
Is to say, okay, I have a narrative.
A narrative. Again, I'm just trying to point out to you the things that are said, the ways in which he phrases things to tell us what he's trying to point our attention towards.
In Genesis, and then modern research can put together this narrative about the origins and timeline and processes of our universe and so on. So the question is, how do those two relate to each other? And where the tension comes, I think the tension comes in people posing it as, well, either this is what happened, and what that happens maps onto this, and so this can't be true. Or this is what happened, and this is exclusive of that, so this can't be true. Or are there other options?
So Tim was just talking about how the problem comes when you are, this isn't his words, but his basic argument there was when you're imposing scientific questions about the processes and timings of the bringing about of the physical world and thinking that that is the crucial aspect of truth that's being said there. And this is exactly what Peterson said earlier that we saw.
Fundamentalists and atheistic scientists have the same problem. The fundamentalists, so we could say the Christian fundamentalists in the US, make the proposition that biblical stories, we'll call them mythological stories, are literal representations of the truth. And that might be true depending on what you mean by literal. But what they mean by literal, or what they attempt to make literal mean, is that they're in the same category as scientific facts about that time.
Okay, here we go.
And more or less that's been accepted as canonical fact ever since. And then the scientists say, well, yeah, those are before Moses, Adam lived, and some bishop did that back in the, I think it was in the mid-1800s. I might be wrong about that, but it was somewhere back about that time. And more or less that's been accepted as canonical fact ever since. And then the scientists say, well, yeah, those are empirical truths, they're just wrong. See, and that's the only difference there is between the fundamentalists and the atheist scientists. The fundamentalists say, those are fundamental scientific truths, and they're right, and the scientists say, well, they're scientific truths, they just happen to be wrong.
Okay. What did Tim just say? Let's pull it back just a little bit here.
Tension comes, I think, the tension comes in people posing it as, well, either this is what happened, and what that happens maps onto this, and so this can't be true. Or this is what happened, and this is exclusive of that, so this can't be true. Or are there other options? Right?
So he's exploring this tension that they both make exclusive claims. Right, this happened, which doesn't match with this description, say evolutionary theory and the 7-day creationist interpretations of Genesis are at odds. They don't match, they can't match. So one has to be right. This is what Peterson's pointing out to us. They both want to point at the scientific facts, the bringing about of creation on the world, and say, that's the truth. That's what this is talking about. And Tim is begging the question, well, to ask the question, why does the Bible not talk about dinosaurs, seems to also presuppose that, well, to prove that they existed, the Bible should talk about dinosaurs. That's another way to phrase it, not as a question, more as a statement. And so he's slowly chipping away at this presupposition that is underlying this question of dinosaurs in the Bible, of the scientific nature of the text, again, trying to bring our frame around to something that is more about the time and the place and the people, the audience. Beginning is the time to make sure that the balances are correct, right? So let's keep going. Tim's question, is there another option?
That's usually how it gets posed. And I believe in a deep way, yes, there are other options. And dinosaurs is a great example, where God apparently used, when it came to the physical structures of the world or the chronological processes involved, God has used human authors, Israelite authors, who are working with an ancient conception of those things. And that doesn't limit God's ability to speak. But what it does mean is that I have to learn how to see the world through another culture's way of seeing things. And I shouldn't try and mesh these two together. I think the problem comes when we force these two together.
You also asked about the authorship. If Moses wrote Genesis, didn't he live 3,500 years ago?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, more saying 3,000 years ago is my nod to the complex debates about the authorship of the Pentateuch.
So that's what I thought. Because
Yeah.
so what is where do you land on the authorship?
Well, a handful of things. Technically, the authorship of the Pentateuch, as we have it, is anonymous, in that nowhere in Genesis does it ever say, hey, here I am,
Right.
Moses, writing this. And of course, Moses isn't even born until 52 chapters into the story.
Yeah, exactly.
So what you at least have to say is, even if I hold to a Mosaic authorship of the whole thing, everything that's before him he received as oral or written traditions that he's compiled. He didn't write them, he compiled or arranged them. So that's one. And then the second thing is there's narratives, material in the Pentateuch itself that it doesn't seem to hide the fact that its time perspective is post-Moses. The most significant chapter being the last one of Deuteronomy, which describes his death in detail. And then the last sentence of the Torah is like, we've never had a prophet like Moses ever since then. And you're like, oh, very clearly reflecting on a long time gap.
Right. As opposed to having someone write the majority, which anybody who wrote the first couple chapters had to have had divine inspiration because everything was before anybody.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's right. So Genesis, true.
Okay. All right, I'm really curious. I don't even remember much about this part of the conversation at all. So you are just, I don't have a lot to say, A, because I'm kind of tired, and B, because it's just kind of interesting to listen to this conversation. I think Tim's explaining things very well. I don't feel like I want to add too much to what he's saying here. But I want to point out something and why I'm laughing at what this guy just said, how he phrased the question as with the dinosaur question shows me a lot about the presuppositions that are underneath the question, as much as he's tracking with Tim's literary interpretations on the days and perhaps the timing or authorship of Moses. So he just commented about the divine inspiration that had to have occurred because whoever wrote the first couple chapters of Genesis was writing about things that happened ever before anyone was alive. Let's see how Tim answers.
True, but also I don't want to import a sense about Genesis 1 that it's like security camera footage that God had just waiting to download into somebody's mind. So specifically Genesis 1 through 11, it's a worldview, cosmology, world purpose statement, but it's very ancient Israelite. And what's interesting is that the language, the air, and the images of Genesis 1 to 11, they have the most commonality with ancient Egyptian, ancient Babylonian, and Canaanite similar stories, ways of talking about world origins. So the idea of chaos or the
Daniel's going to make a video about this, by the way, once more videos in this Genesis series come out. So if you're excited about that, if you're curious about that, if you want that, comment below. Tell Daniel to get started on that because he's been working on a project for that for a while. He's pitching that to me in private. I hope he's cool with me saying this here. Last week, a couple days ago, and yeah, I think he's going to want to do exactly that in the future.
The world as a cosmic ocean and land emerging. That's all over ancient Babylonian.
But again, I'm going to point this out here and let him continue to talk. What is he doing here? Again, as Peterson's pointing out to us, the fundamentalist will assert that these are literal representations of the truth. A beginning is the time to make sure that the balances are correct. This every sister of the Bene Gesserit knows. To begin your life with the study of Muad'Dib, then make sure that you place him and his time, born in the 57th year of the Parashah Emperor Shaddam IV. Audience, place, time, purpose. Ancient Israelites, what would have been around them? What were the other stories that were going on about the creation? And Tim saying, well, if you look at those stories, they're ancient Israelites who wrote them. So to think of it as a video camera downloaded to somebody's brain about the Matrix, I do Kung Fu now, might not actually be right. Because these stories are also talking to other stories, as all stories do. And they have something to say, and they're going to have similarities. That's why we have genres. That's why we know when tropes are fulfilled or when tropes are subverted. And so take something like Django, for instance. I'm just going to use it as an example. None of you will be surprised. I think I've talked about this before, but I'll use it as an explicit example here. Okay? So as Tim is describing in these ancient stories, these conversations that the Israelite story of creation is having with them, we can think of Django as not only a conversation, Django Unchained, I should specify, because there's a movie called Django, which he's riffing on. Django Unchained by Quentin Tarantino, he is subverting the genre of Westerns. It's very, very clear. There's no way he's not. I mean, down to the music, down to the time period, down to the characters, right? But what he does with them is very interesting. He makes Django... by the way, he race swaps the main character. Django is no longer a white cowboy. He's a black slave. And he's a man on a mission taken under the wing of a foreigner, a German dentist, to enact revenge on those who bought and sold him and to get his wife back. And the movie ends with Django killing all the people in the house and burning the Candyland Ranch to the ground, literally exploding it. So, in a genre that is very much about, and it's not this simple, okay? There's a great episode Paul Wernicke did on Jesus and John Wayne. Some people were reacting to that was really interesting about breaking down some of the naive views that Westerns are all simplistic good versus bad guys. The good guys always being the white guy on the horse, the bad guy always being the indigenous or Indian person or the tribe that they are trying to conquer or partner with in some cases. Or even it doesn't even have to be the foreigner necessarily. It can be the evil landowner or the evil businessman or the one who is stealing the resources, right? You have all of these tropes that happen in the Western genre, and Tarantino flips it in making the foreigner, the outsider, the hero. And he's made no bones about this. He's spoken explicitly about how he wanted to make a revenge story of the series Roots when Roots didn't pay off the revenge plot that he wanted. And so, all that is to say that to think about Genesis talking to these genres in a certain way, because you can't understand Django and its full complexity if you don't understand Westerns, if you don't understand the genre. Same thing here. Tim's seeming to start to argue that you cannot understand what's going on in Genesis here if you don't understand the genre, if you don't understand the tropes, if you don't understand the things it is trying to also say that are similar and the things it's also trying to say that are different, the things it's trying to invert, as Tarantino does in many of his movies. And so there's an example for you.
Literature about where the world came from and so on. And so what we have in the Bible is like a Jewish monotheist, Yahweh is created.
Well, I won't go on. Anyway, I know what he means, but I'm not going to pick any bones because he's making a good point.
Creator and ruler of all things. And we're getting their conception of that story, but they're doing it in dialogue with ancient conversation partners. My silly illustration is that Genesis 1 to 11 is like Moses going into a bar with a Babylonian, a Canaanite, an Egyptian, and talking about why we're all here and what we're doing here. And so these narratives speak in similar language. And so I always want to make sense of it in that context.
There's going to be a corruption of the biblical narrative, and then you get the Babylonian, Sumerian, and the others are corruptions.
Boy, yeah, I mean, I know that argument exists. It's not a very good explanation, especially because a lot of this material predates, especially the Babylonian flood narratives and creation narratives. I mean, ancient Babylonian culture is much older than Israelite culture. So it's more about that out of the ancient nations, God called the family of Abraham into existence, revealed himself through the burning bush, and the Exodus and all these things. And that led these authors, guided by the Spirit, to fundamentally rethink everything they know about the world.
Okay, oh my God, okay, I'm sorry. I have something I'm going to go grab. I have to read it. Okay, I don't know how much of this I'm going to read. We'll find out. This is from Lesslie Newbigin's book. Daniel will be happy that I'm reading this. The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. I think, Daniel, this might have popped into your head as he was making this comment. So let's go back just a bit here and hear that again, okay?
So it's more about that
Sumerian and the others are corrupt.
And so
he's talking about Tim is on the idea that the way he likes to describe the usage of, again, these genres, these forms of storytelling, being like Moses walking into a bar with a Canaanite, an Egyptian, and a Babylonian, and talking about, what does it mean for us to be here? What does it mean to be human? What are we doing on the earth? What is the proper pathway to follow? Things of that nature.
I always want to make sense of it in that context.
There's going to be a corruption of the biblical narrative, and then you get the Babylonian, Sumerian, and the others are corruptions.
Boy, yeah, I mean, I know that argument exists. It's not a very good explanation, especially because a lot of this material predates, especially the Babylonian flood narratives and creation narratives. I mean, ancient Babylonian culture is much older than Israelite culture. So it's more about that out of the ancient nations, God called the family of Abraham into existence, revealed himself through the burning bush, and the Exodus.
Okay, here's what sparked my mind. Out of these ancient cultures, God calls a specific people, right? The beginning is the time to make sure that the balances are correct. I'm going to keep repeating that because I want us to not forget that we need to place it in its time, in its place. So I'm going to read from Lesslie Newbigin's The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. This is chapter 8. This is called The Bible as universal history. Newbigin says, a learned Hindu friend has several times complained to me that we Christians have misinterpreted the Bible. He has said to me something like this, quote, as I read the Bible, I find in it a quite unique interpretation of universal history, and therefore a unique understanding of the human person as a responsible actor in history. You Christian missionaries have talked of the Bible as if it were simply another book of religion. We have plenty of these already in India, and we do not need another to add to our supply. Surely this complaint has some justice. Certainly the Bible is sharply different from the sacred books of the East at exactly this point. Unlike them, it sets out to speak of human life in the context of a version of universal, cosmic history. Although, of course, it contains a great variety of material, legal codes, prayers, wise sayings, and moral instruction, it is, in its overall plan and in a great part of its content, history. It sets before us a vision of cosmic history from the creation of the world to its consummation, of the nations that make up the one human family, and, of course, of the one nation chosen to be the bearer of the meaning of history for the sake of all, and of one man called to be the bearer of the meaning for that nation. The Bible is universal history. How then are we to assess it in relation to other versions of history which are offered in our culture, whether world history as taught in the schools and universities, or natural history as is depicted by the biologist, paleontologist, and cosmologist? To try to answer that question fully would require much deeper consideration than I am capable of, but one can begin by asking another question. What does it mean to write or tell history? It cannot mean the recording of all the uncounted millions of things which have happened in the past, including dinosaurs. It involves selection, and this means selection on the basis of what is significant. Back to Lennox's points about the major emphases. But significant for what? The answer depends on one's belief about the point of the story. If it is the history of a small society, a school or a college, for example, the things selected for inclusion will be those that contribute to the growth and development of the school. But even here, histories will differ about what is important according to their different views of what the college should be. Probably, most of the history taught in European schools in the past 2 or 3 centuries has been national history, the history of one's own nation and of others insofar as they impinged on ours. World history, when it is taught, is usually taught as the history of civilization. The significant facts are those which have had a bearing on the development of the kind of society which we now regard as modern. But is this, in fact, the point of the story? Many people in many cultures have denied that world history in this sense can be written. If human affairs are, like the rest of nature, essentially cyclical in character, moving endlessly through the cycles of birth, growth, maturity, decay, and death, then events are hardly worth recording, and if there is to be a history, it will not be of civilization, but of the rise and fall of civilizations in a series which does not lead to any significant end. What we are required to attempt is the much more difficult emphasis to try to understand modern thought in the light of the biblical story, which is what Tim is doing here. But is this possible? Many would deny that it is. In a recent review article in the Journal of Theology, the writer said that trying to criticize one's own culture is like trying to push a bus while you're sitting in it. Modern thought is not something outside me as a Christian. My whole education and even my theological training has shaped me into a person who shares the way of thinking that is roughly covered by the phrase, the modern scientific worldview. Is there any escape from this? Can I get off the bus? Can I stand outside myself and look at my way of thinking as a critic of it? More specifically, can this book, one among millions of books, which we call the book, the Bible, call into question the way in which I, a member of this society, understand the world? This is a point at which the experience of a foreign missionary has something to contribute. A missionary in India learns to realize that there are certain ways of understanding the world that are so fundamental that they have never been questioned in all the revolutions of Indian thought, from the Buddha to the Mahatma, from Gautama to Gandhi. I mean, for example, the doctrines of karma and samsara, which see human life in terms of the wheel of nature, the endless cycle of birth, growth, maturity, decay, death, and then a new birth. This is, strictly speaking, the natural way of understanding human life, the life of the individual and the life of the nations. Within this view, it is therefore inconceivable that the life of one man at a particular point in history could permanently alter the state of things. Jesus can illustrate the truth about the human condition, but he cannot change it. And so, as I've mentioned earlier, the portrait of Jesus can be happily accommodated in the premises of a Hindu missionary establishment because Jesus has been painlessly incorporated into the Hindu worldview. The foreign missionary knows that this is not the conversion of India, but the co-option of Jesus, the domestication of the gospel into the Hindu worldview. He only slowly begins to realize that the same thing has happened in the West. Jesus understood, in light of the assumptions which control our culture, when reason is invoked as a parallel or supplementary authority to Scripture and tradition, what is happening is that Jesus is being co-opted into the reigning plausibility structures. But the business of the missionary and the business of the Christian church in any situation is to change the plausibility structures in the light of God's revelation of the real meaning of history. How is this to be done? Archimedes said, "Give me a lever and a fulcrum outside the earth, and I will move the earth." Where can we find that Archimedean point outside our culture? Are we compelled to sit tight in the bus, even if it's headed for a precipice? Or can we appeal to the Bible to call our culture into question? One group of people who says yes are the people usually called fundamentalists. Obviously, that term can be used in a wide variety of ways. Fundamentalists are often dismissed as obstinate or crazy fanatics, and some may be. Whatever their defects, they recognize the problem. We cannot speak with confidence about biblical authority. What ground have we for changing the reigning plausibility structure? But the fundamentalist case has been flawed. If the Bible is treated as a compendium of factually inerrant propositions about everything in heaven and earth, then it is impossible to explain both the contradictions between parts of the Bible and things we certainly know about the result of the work of science, and also the obvious inconsistencies within the Bible itself on factual matters. Even the most convinced fundamentalist who lives in the modern world has to rely at immutable points on knowledge provided by science and not by the Bible. In fact, this way of looking at the Bible is nearer to the Muslim way of looking at the Quran, and prompts the question, why then did Jesus not write a book as the prophet did? I'll read that again. If the Bible is to be treated as a compendium of factually inerrant propositions about everything in heaven and earth, then it is impossible to explain both the contradictions between parts of the Bible and things we certainly know to be the results of the work of science, and also the obvious inconsistencies within the Bible itself on factual matters. Even the most convinced fundamentalist who lives in the modern world has to rely at immutable points on knowledge provided by science and not by the Bible. In fact, this way of looking at the Bible is near to the Muslim way of looking at the Quran, and prompts the question, why then did Jesus not write a book as the prophet did? This is exactly the problem that Peterson is pointing out to us, and that Mackie is trying to get us to shift our attention on the Bible, not as immutable propositions about facts in the world, but about a turning, about a scene, about a story, about a narrative. That's why it's called beginning the right story, beginning the story right. Let us not co-opt Jesus into our plausibility structure. This is, again, a lot of the underground work that's going into my essay on what causes a Christian worldview. Tim is trying to expose us to a Christian worldview, not co-opting Jesus for the scientific worldview. So what does it mean for Israel to write a history, to write a story about what happened and where the earth is going? I have to suppose this is in 2 parts. This is getting too long. Where's my mouse? There we are. I think I'm going to end this video here. I'll have a second part. Probably record that tomorrow. Have a second part later because we need to get to some interesting stuff about Adam and Eve here. But I want to end with where I didn't get with this video of Peterson last time.
Trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology. So that's a big problem. So here's another way of thinking about it. You don't just need one way of looking at the world.
The scientific way. Or the fundamentalist way. The way of saying that the bringing about of the natural causes of the world are the primary story that we're trying to tell. And again, I just want to point our attention to these major shifts that are happening as we go through this, as I think through this again, as I try and take you on this journey. Tim originally said in that first video, and Piper, Tim, as I played it in the beginning, Tim originally said, maybe viewing this as a story about the processes of creation is going to hinder your witness, isn't the way to look at the story. And John Piper, someone who takes the Bible very seriously, who is going to talk about, as Lennox has said, the resurrection of Jesus Christ as central to the Christian faith, taking that as true, as factual, as historical, can leave room to have a different view on the age of the earth and certain interpretations in Genesis. And I thought, oh man, this is going to be an interesting ride. And now we're here talking with Tim, who's taking questions and ever trying to position us, ever trying to change our view, ever trying to get us to look through the diamond with another glint of the prism. And trying to get us to think, well, hang on, a certain group of people, as Peterson wrote out, who were not scientists, wrote this, as Newbigin is trying to tell us, is trying to tell a certain story about history. What would happen if Abraham, if Moses were in the bar with the Canaanite, with the Babylonian, with the Egyptian, and they were to talk about, what does it mean to be human? Why are we here? How did we get here? Where are we going? That seems to be what we're talking about. That's where Mackie's trying to point our attention. And if we need to begin the story right, if we need to make sure that the balances are correct, if we need to know the genre that we're playing in to understand what's being shown on the screen, the story that's being written, to understand how things are being subverted, how things are being brought back, how things are being re-emphasized, there's a certain way we need to understand it. And perhaps one of the major emphases is not about the physical processes and the timing that brought about the creation. Maybe something else is going on here. As his Hindu friend said, as I read the Bible, I find in it a quite unique interpretation of universal history, and therefore a unique understanding of the human person as a responsible actor in history. You Christian missionaries have talked about the Bible as if it were simply another book of religion. We have plenty of those already in India, and we do not need another to add to our supply.
Maybe you need two ways of looking at the world, and I'm not exactly sure how they should be related to one another, like which should take precedence under which circumstance. But one problem is, what's the world made of? You know, what's the world conceptualized as an objective place made of? And the other is, how should you conduct yourself while you're alive? And there's no reason to assume that those questions can be answered using the same approach. I mean, physics has its methods, and chemistry has its methods, and biology has its methods. So a method for obtaining the truth can be bound to a domain. So why would we necessarily assume that you could use the same set of tools to represent the world as a place of objects and to represent it as a place in which a biological creature would act? I mean, anyways, I'm suggesting that we don't view it that way, that we have two different viewpoints. Maybe they can be brought together, although it's not obvious how, but that it's not a tenable solution to get rid of one in favor of the other. And I think the reason for that is that you need to know how to conduct yourself in the world. You have to have a value system. You can't even look at the damn world without a value system. It's not possible. Your emotional health is dependent on a value system. The way you interact with other people is dependent on a value system. There's no getting away from it. And you say, well, there's no justification for any value system from a scientific perspective. You're going to draw that conclusion that no value system is valid. Where the hell does that leave you? There's no down, there's no up, there's no rationale for moving in any direction. There's not even really any rationale for living, and so people say things like that. Well, why the hell should I care what happens in a million years? Who's going to know the difference? It's like, yeah, true, stupid, but true. And the reason I think it's stupid is because it's just a game. You know, I can take anything of any sort and find a context in which it's irrelevant. It's just a rational game. It's like, who cares if 100 children freeze to death in a blizzard? What difference is it going to make a billion years? Well, what do you say to someone who says that? You say, well, seems like the wrong frame of reference, bucko. That's what it looks like to me. You know, because at some point you question the damn frame of reference, not what you derive from it. And it certainly seems to me that situations like that don't allow you to use that kind of frame of reference. There's something inhumane about it. And that trumps the logic, or at least it should. And if it doesn't, then all hell breaks loose, and that doesn't seem to be a good thing.
I'll read it one more time. As I read the Bible, I find in it a quite unique interpretation of universal history, and therefore a unique understanding of the human person as a responsible actor in history. You Christian missionaries have talked of the Bible as if it were simply another book of religion. We have plenty of those already in India, and we need not another to add to our supply. I'll leave this here. I'll come back with part 2, and we will talk about Adam and Eve and some more of Tim Mackie, and who knows what else will come to my mind as we discuss this. It's part of the fun. So if you're here still watching, thank you very much, and I'll be making the next one tomorrow and post it whenever I get to it.